The headline is a temptation, and like most temptations, it flatters the reader by implying that something obvious was missed by duller minds in Washington. It also smuggles in a precision, $500 billion that suggests a ledger entry, a signature, a single cunning maneuver. That is not how serious countries behave, and it is not how Canada behaves. There has been no single Canadian stroke of the pen that instantly transferred $500 billion of advantage from the Potomac to the Ottawa River. What there has been instead is a long, patient accumulation of decisions, some prudent, some lucky, some merely less foolish than alternatives, that when aggregated by headline writers congeal into a dramatic but misleading sum. The truth, which is less cinematic and more instructive, is that Canada has benefited from institutional habits that Washington has lately neglected: fiscal sobriety within large public investors, regulatory predictability, and an unromantic understanding of what a middle power can do well. Begin with a number. Roughly speaking, and roughness is all that honesty permits here, Canadian pension funds and public investors manage assets that run into the trillions of dollars. Over decades, they have allocated large portions of those assets into global infrastructure, real estate, energy, logistics, and finance, much of it in the United States. If one were to add up net positions, long-term capital commitments, and reinvested returns over time, one could arrive at a figure approaching or surpassing $500 billion. But this is an accumulation, not a move. It reflects compounding, not cunning. Canada did not outplay Washington so much as it played a long game while Washington distracted itself with short ones. Canada's large pension funds are a peculiarity worth understanding. They are public in origin but private in method, insulated by law and culture from the daily gusts of politics. Their mandate is not to advance a national industrial policy in the French sense, nor to serve as piggy banks for vote buying in the American sense, but to earn returns for beneficiaries over generations. That mandate has produced a cadre of investors who think in decades, not quarter. When American infrastructure decayed amid partisan stalemate, Canadian capital flowed south, not as a rescue, but as a purchase. Toll roads, ports, utilities, airports, these are not ideological baubles. They are boring assets that throw off steady cash. Canada noticed. Washington argued. There is an irony here that should discomfort American triumphalism. The United States, which lectures the world on markets, has allowed its own public capital to be politicized to the point of paralysis. Canada, caricatured in some American minds as statist, has constructed market-oriented institutions that function with enviable discipline. This is not because Canadians are wiser by nature. It is because they made unglamorous choices about governance. Boards were professionalized, mandates were clarified, politicians were told credibly to keep their hands off. The result is not a coup but competence. Energy provides another example where myth outruns fact. Canada is an energy power by geography and geology. It has oil, gas, uranium, hydroelectric potential, and now critical minerals. The United States has all of these as well, often in greater abundance. The difference has been less about endowment than about permission. Canada has argued with itself about pipelines, to be sure, but it has not embraced the American habit of treating every infrastructure project as a moral referendum. The consequence has been that Canadian energy has found markets, capital has found returns, and the country has maintained a degree of energy realism that Washington intermittently rediscovers during crises and then forgets during campaigns. Again, the $500 billion trope intrudes. If one tallies the value of energy exports, investments, and long-term supply agreements that hinge on Canada's relative stability, the number grows large, but it grows the way a tree grows, ring by ring. There was no secret meeting in Ottawa where officials plotted to humiliate Washington. There was instead a sustained willingness to let engineers build and financiers finance while politicians postured at a safe remove. Trade, too, has been less dramatic than advertised. Canada did not outwit the United States in negotiations so much as it endured. Geography guarantees intimacy, power asymmetry guarantees friction. The revised North American trade arrangements were not a Canadian victory lap, but a damage control exercise. Yet Canada emerged with its core interests intact because it understood what they were. Washington, by contrast, oscillated between maximalist rhetoric and minimalist preparation. The result was not defeat, but exhaustion, and in exhaustion, small advantages accrue to the patient. The larger lesson is not about Canada's cleverness, but about America's drift. When Washington indulges the fantasy that policy is theater, each move calibrated for applause, it invites others to profit from its inattention. That profit does not require genius, it requires seriousness. Canada's advantage has been seriousness institutionalized. It has built mechanisms that quietly harvest returns from America's inability to do the same. It is fashionable to describe this as outplaying, as if geopolitics were a chessboard and nations were grandmasters. That metaphor flatters commentators and misleads citizens. Most outcomes in international political economy are the product of plumbing, not poetry. Pipes laid decades ago determine flows today. Canada laid pipes. Washington argued about slogans. The money followed gravity. To insist on truth is to resist melodrama. There has been no single $500 billion Canadian ambush. There has been a long demonstration that competence compounds. That is less exciting than a headline, but more unsettling, because it suggests that America's relative losses are self-inflicted and reversible only by habits it has neglected to practice. Canada did not beat Washington by being bolder. It did so by being steadier. That is not a move no one saw coming. It is a process many chose not to see. If the first 1,000 words have stripped the headline of its pyrotechnics, the next 1,000 should examine the cultural and political soil in which these outcomes took root. Canada's political culture is often caricatured as polite and cautious, which obscures its defining trait, incrementalism. Incrementalism is unfashionable in an age addicted to disruption, but it is a formidable advantage in capital-intensive domains. Infrastructure, pensions, energy grids, and supply chains reward continuity. Canada has made continuity a virtue. The United States has treated it as a vice. Consider pensions again, because they are the ballast of the story. American public pensions are a patchwork of promises, many underfunded, many subject to optimistic assumptions that substitute hope for arithmetic. Canada confronted its pension arithmetic earlier and more honestly. Reforms were painful and uncelebrated. Contributions rose, benefits were adjusted, governance was overhauled. The payoff was not applause, but solvency. Solvency in turn enabled investment. Investment enabled influence, not the crude influence of diktat, but the quiet influence of ownership. Ownership matters. When Canadian funds own stakes in American infrastructure, they do not dictate policy, they insist on maintenance, efficiency, and return. These demands are not ideological, they are fiduciary. They impose discipline where politics often cannot. The United States benefits from this discipline even as it bristles at the notion that foreign capital is stewarding domestic assets. The bristling is understandable and misplaced. Capital does not have a passport, it has a timetable. Canada supplied patient capital when America supplied impatient. There's also a demographic subtext. Canada has pursued immigration policies that, whatever their controversies, are explicitly tied to economic needs. The United States has argued about immigration as a cultural symbol while neglecting its economic function. Skilled labor, entrepreneurs, and students have found in Canada a system that, while imperfect, is legible. Legibility attracts investment. Again, there is no grand maneuver here, only alignment between policy and purpose. The supply chain anxieties of recent years have added another layer to the myth-making. Canada is adjacent to the world's largest consumer market, politically stable and resource-rich. It has marketed itself as a reliable partner in an unreliable world. The United States has spoken the same language while sometimes behaving otherwise, lurching between protectionist impulses and alliance rhetoric. Reliability is cumulative. When firms decide where to place long-lived assets, they discount noise. Canada has generated less noise. The $500 billion figure resurfaces in discussions of critical minerals and energy transition, where estimates of required investment are enormous. Canada is often mentioned as a beneficiary. Mentioned is not the same as endowed. Projects must clear regulatory hurdles, attract capital, and survive market cycles. Canada's advantage, to the extent it exists, lies in process rather than proclamation. Washington has made proclamations, Ottawa has tended to make processes endure. It would be a mistake to romanticize Canada as a paragon. It has its own indulgences, its own regulatory excesses, its own bouts of magical thinking. Housing affordability is a warning sign. Fiscal pressures loom. Regional resentments persist. None of this is concealed. But the comparison with Washington is not between perfection and failure. It is between coherence and cacophony. Coherence wins quietly. What then of the charge that Canada played Washington? The metaphor applies intent and contest. Intent exists. Contest is overdrawn. Canada intends to secure prosperity for its citizens. So does the United States. The difference is that Canada has been more willing to subordinate politics to policy in specific domains. The United States has been more willing to subordinate policy to politics. The outcome is not a checkmate, but an accumulation of small advantages that, when tallied by headline writers, become fantastical sums. Truth-telling requires acknowledging that America remains wealthier, more innovative, and more powerful than Canada by almost any measure. A $500 billion headline does not invert that reality. It does, however, highlight a vulnerability, the ease with which a rich country can squander advantages by neglecting the institutions that translate wealth into welfare. Canada has tended those institutions with a gardener's patience. Washington has treated them like a stage set rearranged between performances. The lesson is not to imitate Canada wholesale. Nations are not interchangeable. The lesson is to recover respect for the mundane virtues that Canada has practiced: clarity of mandate, insulation from partisan frenzy, and an acceptance that the most important moves are rarely announced. If America does that, future headlines will need to invent new numbers. If it does not, numbers will continue to be invented for it. The final 1,000 words should return, as George Will would, to first principles. Conservatism, properly understood, is not nostalgia but prudence. It is the preference for tested arrangements over thrilling improvisations. Canada's recent advantages, to the extent they are real, are a vindication of prudence. America's recent frustrations are a rebuke to its abandonment. Prudence begins with limits. Canada knows it is not a hegemon. It does not attempt to choreograph the world. It selects niches where it can be excellent and leaves grandiosity to others. The United States has struggled with limits because it has enjoyed abundance. Abundance breeds carelessness. Carelessness erodes trust. Trust, once lost, is expensive to repurchase. The $500 billion figure, stripped of its drama, is a proxy for trust. Investors have trusted Canadian institutions to steward capital across borders and decades. They have trusted processes to outlast governments. They have trusted arithmetic over rhetoric. That trust manifests as money, but it is not money's origin. Money follows belief. Belief is not blind, it is earned. Canada earned it through boredom. Boredom is underrated. Boring institutions that do what they say year after year accumulate credibility. Washington has made itself interesting. Interest is not the same as confidence. There is also a moral dimension that should not be ignored. When public pensions are well managed, retirees are secure without intergenerational theft. When infrastructure is maintained, citizens are not forced to subsidize neglect with accidents and delays. When energy policy acknowledges reality, the poor are not punished by fashionable scarcity. These are not technocratic niceties. They are ethical choices. Canada has made some of them better than the United States recently. That is not a taunt, it is an invitation. Invitations can be declined. America may prefer the intoxication of performative politics to the sobriety of administration. If so, headlines will continue to dramatize other countries' competence as American decline. That narrative flatters cynicism and excuses inaction. It is also false. Decline is not destiny. Institutions can be repaired. Habits can be relearned. What would relearning look like? It would look like depoliticizing public capital, accepting that not every decision is a referendum on identity. It would look like regulatory processes that conclude. It would look like trade treated as an instrument of prosperity rather than a prop in cultural skirmishes. None of this requires genius. It requires Canada's example, if it is an example, is modest. It does not promise miracles. It promises competence. Competence does not trend on social media. It does, however, pay dividends, literally. Those dividends, aggregated over time, tempt commentators to assign a dollar figure and declare a winner. That is the wrong frame. The right frame is stewardship. Nations are stewards of inherited advantages. Some squander them flamboyantly, others husband them quietly. Canada has done more of the latter than the former in certain domains. The United States has done the reverse too often of late. The correction does not require envy. It requires emulation of virtues that Americans once prized and can again. If there is a final word to be offered in the spirit of George Will, it is this: politics is downstream from culture, and culture is shaped by what a society honors. Canada has honored administrators. America has honored entertainers. The market, indifferent to flattery, has noticed the $500 billion headline is a symptom, not a cause. To continue in the same vein is to risk repetition, but repetition can be instructive when it reveals a pattern rather than a slogan. The pattern here is not Canadian cunning, but American restlessness. Restlessness is a curious vice in a republic founded on patience, patience for institutions to mature, for laws to settle, for habits to form. The American founders designed a system to frustrate speed precisely because speed magnifies error. Canada, inheriting a Westminster tradition with its own checks and balances, has retained a cultural suspicion of haste. Washington, intoxicated by its own scale and its media ecology, has increasingly treated haste as a virtue. The modern American political economy is dominated by announcement. Policies are announced. Frameworks are announced. Initiatives are announced. Canada has been less theatrical. Its successes, again, where they exist, are discovered after the fact by accountants, not proclaimed in advance by press secretaries. This difference matters because capital is allergic to uncertainty, but tolerant of dullness. When rules are legible and enforcement predictable, investors can price risk. When rules change by tweet or by cable news cycle, risk becomes incalculable, and capital demands a premium or departs. This is why the notion of a single move is so misleading. Moves belong to games. Economies are ecosystems. In ecosystems, advantages accrue to species that fit their environment. Canada has shaped an environment congenial to long-term capital. The United States has periodically poisoned its own environment with spasms of self-doubt and self-dramatization. The result is not extinction, but inefficiency. Consider the American habit of turning every policy dispute into a morality play. Infrastructure is not poured, it is debated as a symbol. Energy is not extracted, it is litigated as a sin. Trade is not negotiated, it is moralized as betrayal or salvation. Canada has moral debates too, but it has been more willing to compartmentalize them, to allow the mundane work of governance to proceed while arguments rage elsewhere. That compartmentalization is a form of maturity. Maturity is unfashionable. It does not excite donors or viewers. Yet maturity is what allows a society to make credible commitments. Credible commitments are the currency of investment. When Canada commits to a regulatory framework, it tends to honor it across electoral cycles. When the United States commits, it often adds an asterisk, subject to the next election, the next court, the next outrage. Investors read asterisk. The irony is that America's size should insulate it from the need to be so scrupulous. It can afford mistakes. Canada cannot. Necessity has disciplined Canada. Luxury has softened America. This is not a permanent condition. History is littered with nations that rediscovered discipline after indulgence. The question is whether America prefers rediscovery to denial. The $500 billion trope, if it has any use, is as a wake-up call stripped of its triumphalism. It invites Americans to ask why patient capital has found Canadian institutions more congenial in certain respects. The answer is not ideology. Canada is not more libertarian than the United States. It is more procedural. Procedures are where ideologies go to be tested. Canada has tested them quietly. America has argued about them loudly. There is also the matter of federalism. Both countries are federations. Canada has managed imperfectly to align provincial interests with national frameworks in areas like pensions and trade. The United States has allowed federalism to become a theater of resistance rather than cooperation. When states compete to sabotage national initiatives, coherence suffers. Coherence is not tyranny, it is coordination. Canada has practiced more of it where it counts. One must also acknowledge contingency. Commodity cycles favored Canada at times. Global capital sought stability during American political convulsions. None of this was scripted. To attribute it all to Canadian foresight is to indulge a flattering fiction, but foresight is not the same as preparedness. Canada was prepared to benefit when conditions shifted. America was prepared to argue about whether the shift was legitimate. The deeper conservatism at work here is respect for time. Time is the most underestimated variable in politics. Policies unfold over decades. Investments mature slowly. Trust accumulates grudgingly. Canada's advantage, such as it is, lies in honoring time's demand. America's disadvantage lies in trying to compress time into election cycles and news cycles. Compression distorts judgment. If there is a cautionary note for Canada, it is that success breeds imitation of the wrong things. It may be tempted to politicize its competent institutions, to treat them as instruments of fashion rather than fiduciary duty. That would squander the very trust it has earned. The American example is instructive not as a foil, but as a warning. For Americans, the prescription is not to resent Canada's sobriety, but to recall their own. The United States once excelled at the very virtues now attributed north of the border: long-term planning, infrastructure building, institutional insulation. Those virtues built a continental economy. They can be revived without borrowing Canadian accents. In the end, the headline collapses under the weight of its own exaggeration. No one was outplayed because no one was playing a game. Canada accumulated advantages by doing ordinary things well. Washington dissipated advantages by doing extraordinary things poorly. The remedy is not a countermove, but a recommitment. That recommitment will not produce a headline. It will not yield a round number. It will be noticed, if at all, years from now, when commentators struggle to explain why capital once again treats American institutions as boring in the best sense of the word. Boring is where prosperity hides. To end where this argument naturally leads is to return to character, national and institutional. Economics, stripped of its equations, is an expression of character over time. Nations reveal themselves not in moments of bravado, but in habits sustained when no one is watching. Canada's recent advantages, again without mystifying them into legend, reflect habits of restraint. America's recent frustrations reflect habits of exhibition. Exhibition is costly. It converts governance into signaling, policy into posture. When every decision is framed as a moral crusade or a cultural skirmish, compromise becomes suspect and continuity becomes cowardice. Canada has been less infected by this pathology, not because it is immune, but because its political incentives have rewarded understatement. Understatement is a strategic asset in a world where overstatement invites correction. Correction often arrives as capital flight or capital diversion. Investors do not write editorials, they rebalance portfolios. When they do so quietly, journalists later infer a drama that was never staged. The $500 billion figure is a forensic artifact, not a battle report. It is discovered after the fact by those who prefer spectacle to stewardship. Stewardship is conservative in the deepest sense. It assumes inheritance and obligation. It treats institutions as trusts rather than trophies. Canada's pension funds, infrastructure authorities, and regulatory bodies have behaved like trustees. Washington's institutions have too often behaved like arenas. Arenas reward winners. Trusts protect beneficiaries. The difference is moral before it is financial. Moral clarity does not require moralization. Canada has managed more often than not to separate ethical debate from administrative execution. The United States has fused them with predictable paralysis. This fusion flatters activists and pundits, but impoverishes outcomes. It also corrodes legitimacy because citizens sense that results matter less than rituals. Rituals have replaced results in much of American public life. Announcements substitute for implementation. Lawsuits substitute for legislating. Outrage substitutes for oversight. Canada has been duller. Dullness, again, is underrated. It permits follow-through. Follow-through produces assets. Assets attract capital. Capital compounds. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, not because it is clever, but because it is patient. Patience is a political liability in democracies that prize immediacy, yet democracies that forget patience invite decay. Canada's example suggests that patience can be institutionalized even in a competitive political environment. This requires a consensus, often tacit, that some domains should be sheltered from constant contestation. Pensions are one, infrastructure is another, energy security is a third. When everything is contested, nothing is built. America once understood this. The interstate highway system was not the product of a viral moment. It was the product of a sustained commitment across administrations. Its benefits dwarfed its costs. Canada has made smaller but analogous commitments in its own context. The scale differs. The principle is the same. Scale, in fact, is America's temptation. Because it is large, it assumes resilience. Resilience is not automatic. It is cultivated. Canada has cultivated it by acknowledging vulnerability. A middle power cannot afford theatrics. A superpower can, until it cannot. The transition from can to cannot is gradual and often unnoticed until headlines invent a turning point. The temptation to narrate decline through rivals' ascent is perennial. It absolves the declining party of responsibility. They outplayed us is easier than we distracted ourselves. The Canadian case does not support the former, it indicts the latter. There is no shame in learning from a neighbor. Canada learned much from American markets, innovation, and federalism. America can learn from Canadian governance without surrendering its character. Indeed, doing so would reclaim a neglected part of that character, respect for institutions as instruments of continuity rather than weapons of momentary advantage. If this sounds unfashionable, that is because fashion is hostile to continuity. Fashion thrives on rupture. Politics has adopted fashion's rhythms. Economics has not. Capital remains stubbornly old-fashioned. It prefers boring returns to exciting losses. Canada has catered to this preference. America has flirted with its opposite. The end of this reflection is not a warning of eclipse, but a counsel of sobriety. Headlines will continue to inflate numbers and dramatize neighbors. The serious work will continue elsewhere, unnoticed in boardrooms, agencies, and statutes that rarely trend. That is where national advantage is made or lost. Canada did not spring a trap. It tended a garden. Washington did not fall victim to cunning. It wandered from cultivation. Gardens can be restored. That is the conservative hope that recovery is possible because institutions, unlike moods, endure when cared for. The final truth, stripped of metaphor, is simple. There was no $500 billion move. There was $500 billion worth of patience.